if this is something that's typically included in legislation, specifically a reference to labor agreements and to community benefits. Would they be considered beyond the scope of what this what the clauses say? Maybe just if you could help me with that.
Absolutely. I thank the member for the question. Indeed, so labor agreements and community benefits agreements are tools that are used. However, they're not typically in legislation. And paragraph B in particular is about addressing underrepresented groups specifically, and so it's the project labor agreements and community benefits agreements are outside of the scope of what the intent of B would be. Yes, indeed.
Okay, thank you. Based on the answers that we've gotten at this point, what I would be seeking is unanimous consent to stand down this amendment and to vote on this clause, as long as the corresponding clause in the amendment to the Canada-Nova Scotia version of this bill. I have to keep saying it because there's a Newfoundland and then there's a Nova Scotia, so we'd have to stand them both down, so that the committee, via the clerk, can seek the opinion of the provinces in writing before we proceed with a vote on these specific amendments and clauses.
Okay, before I proceed to that, Mr. Bruson, I'm just going to hold for 1 sec here and just... We'll suspend for a few minutes. Colleagues, I will ask, do we have unanimous consent to stand clause 38 and 147? We do not have unanimous consent? Okay. Okay, we will, yes, go ahead, Mr. Bruson.
I guess that's too bad, because it would have given us the time to get the opinion from the provinces directly on this. But in light of the fact that they're going to have to pass mirror legislation that mirrors what we're passing now in these discussions, I'm going to need to oppose the NDP amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Bruson. We'll now go to Mr. Patzer.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Now,
Almost like it's been rushed.
yeah, exactly. I'm going to speak from my own personal experience here. I have worked in the wind industry previously. I was not a unionized employee, which that's fine. Some people, some businesses, their employees unionize, some they don't. But the company I worked for certainly was not. The company I worked for had all kinds of, it was an international company, but they had North American headquarters. There's an overseas company, but there were several different divisions of the company, and as far as I know, I don't believe that any of them were unionized. So I don't think that when you prescribe, I do think that what the experts at the end of the table said about there's no need to include certain language in there because the terms as the bill already had in it encompass that. I think that would better, the way it was originally written, would better reflect the workforce scenario, because it does include unionized workers, but it also includes non-unionized workers. So I think we need to make sure that it's reflected that way. And also in a different job that I had, a company I worked for 10 years, not in the wind industry, a different one. I was a member of Unifor, shocker, I know, but it was a big corporation that I worked for. So there are unionized workers within Canadian corporations as well. So I think that it's generally understood that is in fact the case. Now, on the surface, project labor agreements and community benefit agreements, particularly I'm going to focus more on the project labor agreements. I think on the surface it sounds like a lovely idea. I get the intent behind them. It seems like a good idea. Practically, especially with wind, it's a lot harder in actuality to do. The reason being that it's a very specialized skill set that you end up needing in certain parts of this industry. So, for example, the company I work for, Vestas Wind Technologies, they had guys who were dedicated wind blade repair technicians. And as far as I know, there was only like 2 of them in all of North America. Even despite the fact that they had several wind farms across North America, the demand for how many blade repair technicians you needed, they only needed like 2 or 3 of them. So for building and installing these machines, a lot of the installation, some of it is specialized, a lot of it is generalized. So you might be, in some breaths, for installation purposes, you might be able to get away with this. But where these companies are looking at is the maintenance and service agreements, and that's where you're getting the long-term jobs. Now, the farm I worked at was 82 machines. There was 9 of us full-time employees on site that did the work on the machines. But the guys who did the installations, there were some local people that were hired to help set them up. But as far as the specialized parts, again, it was a traveling crew. There was 2 traveling crews, one in Canada, there's 3. There's 1 in Canada and 2 in the United States. It was those crews that traveled around and did all the site installations. Again, because you're not going to have the long-term installation of these machines to justify having something that's going to prescribe that you need to have a vast and robust labor force for the installation of wind turbines, right? I know that some people will think that we're just gonna, because there's so many to build that it'll work, but the reality is they're gonna build a couple of these farms, and that's where it'll pause in that region for where it's just the way it works. And these people are gonna have to travel around the country in order to keep being installers. Unless they get in on a service agreement to be a maintenance tech. But at that point, same thing, you're going to be a maintenance tech. If you need blade work, you're going to bring in blade technicians. It might be from the company, it might be a contractor. If you need to swap out a genset, most likely you're bringing in someone that's got the specialty skill to be able to swap out a genset. If you need to take the nacelle off, you're going to be bringing in specialty equipment, and you're not just going to be able to have that in a project labor agreement. You're not just going to have someone sitting around waiting for 5 years for the first genset to blow up and need to be replaced, right? Like it's just, the practicality of it isn't going to work. So that's why I don't, again, it's not that I think that it comes from the right spirit, but I just think practically I don't think it's going to work. So I don't think including that within this amendment is going to actually benefit the area. The intent seems fine, but the practicality of it isn't going to work out in this particular instance.
Thank you, Mr. Patzer, for your detailed intervention and telling us a little bit more on your experiences. I will now proceed to Mr. Angus. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, Canada is the only G7 country without an offshore wind industry, so we are behind the 8 ball. We know that coming off the North Shore, the amount of trained workers, many of who came off the oil patch, will be just picked up very quickly to come and do the work. Because they'll come in on contract and they'll move quickly. Unless we have labor benefit agreements, we lose. In comparison to what Mr. Patzer said, it's common in mining, and I've dealt with many cases where we've tried to get, say, from Finland expertise, if we're adding new equipment, specific equipment that brings in a specific set of skills. You bring those people in on short-term work agreements so that they can, because that's their specialty. But the work itself is done by Canadian trained workers. And I would be, anybody who thinks that the operating engineers of Canada aren't trained and ready to take on any job in offshore wind, I don't believe that. Anyone who thinks that the IBW workers are not ready to take on any job in offshore wind, I don't believe that. Anybody who thinks that the longshore workers out of Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia, who work on so many of the rigs and bringing people back and forth aren't able to do this work, I don't buy that. But you need to have the labor benefit agreements, because companies easily will take contract workers from whatever And if they're coming off out of Fife and saying, hey, we'll send in our crew, we'll fly in, we'll fly out, those jobs are going to be going to Scotland, and they're not going to Canada. And I would think it would be a real tragedy if we passed this. I mean, I'd be more than willing to have stood this down so we could actually talk to Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia, because it's about jobs. It's about their jobs. But if the Conservatives want to force this, then we'll vote. But it is important to say labor benefit agreements, Biden put those in because they knew easily they could be bringing in workers from Korea. They could be bringing in workers from anywhere. That's how this is done. So the labor benefit agreements, it doesn't mean they're all going to be unionized. It doesn't mean they're all going to be locked in. But if you sign in a contract that you're going to say we have to have some commitments to work in Canada, that's the fundamental principle, and I certainly would, any day of the week, would trust the skills that we've seen in Canadian-trained workers to be able to do any job.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. We'll now go to Mr. Dreeshen.
Thank you. And then having listened to the commentary for the last few minutes, I think there's a distinction to be made. We have construction-type jobs, which is basically what we are talking about. Yes, we need to have that sort of expectation and expertise. And then the other side, we have maintenance, but there's also the operational part. And I think that's the difference when we talk about, we're going to bring people that are used to working in the oil sands and that they're and oil and gas, and that they're then going to be able to jump into these types of jobs. These jobs are gone once the construction is done. I mean, this isn't as though this is a long-term employment plan, and the companies are going to use what they can to get these things built as quickly as they can and get them out and start getting their money from the government on this. So I mean, so those are the realities that exist, and to think that this is going to, even though they're going to have if the plan works to break up the oil and gas industry so that it can't be workable anymore, those are not the kind of jobs that those folks are used to. It's day-to-day tough jobs that they are working on, and that's what you do in oil and gas. It's not, okay, once the windmill's up there, then we'll just watch her spin. So I think it's important to recognize that this is not going to be that panacea for job